Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, and I'm co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. We are very honored this evening to have Dr. Christina Hoven, Dr. Larkin McReynolds, and Dr. Lauren Samsel to share their preliminary findings on the impact of pandemic on U.S. college students' mental health and decision-making as a part of a high-profile NIH-sponsored study. So let me briefly introduce our panel, but I would like to encourage everyone to check our website for the full bios. Dr. Christina Hoven, a child psychiatric epidemiologist, is a graduate of the School of Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. She is a professor of epidemiology and psychiatry and director of Global Psychiatric Epidemiology Group at the Columbia University Medical Center. Dr. Hoven has carried out investigations throughout the world, including a 9-country study of child mental health awareness done in collaboration with WHO and World Psychiatric Association. Professor Hoven is currently attempting to identify biological markers of familial transmission of substance abuse and other psychopathologies through genetics, epigenetics, neuroimaging, etc., in her epidemiological samples. Dr. Larkin McReynolds is an assistant professor of clinical epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. She is a national expert regarding the use and analysis of the voice diagnostic interview schedule for children and other audio computer administered screening interviews for behavioral assessment in juvenile justice settings. More recently, her research interests have expanded to examine short and long-term emotional, behavioral, and general health outcomes among persons who experience trauma and/or adversity during adolescence. Last but not least, Dr. Lauren Samsel serves as an attending psychiatrist and a research psychiatrist at Columbia University. Dr. Amsel studied mathematics at Columbia University before entering Yale University School of Medicine. After completing residency training, he joined the Columbia faculty, completing 2 National Institute of Mental Health Research Fellowships and obtained a master's in public health, specializing in mental health statistics and child psychiatry research. Dr. Amsel was one of the early champions of the application modeling based on decision science, game theory, and behavioral economics to psychiatric research. So without further ado, Dr. Please take it away, panel.
Great. I wanted to be able to share my screen, so the host just needs to disable.
Yeah, just a moment.
Perfect. So I will go and do that, share my screen. Excellent. Thank you. So Christina, do you want to start us off?
I'm here.
Okay,
Christina,
so
you might come.
yeah. First of all, I just want to say it's a real pleasure to have all of us as alumni speaking to all of you as alumni, because if you're not a Columbia alumni, who are you? I mean, what are you? So we certainly appreciate that we were given the opportunity to speak to you. And before I start, I just want to say, although Larkin looks older than me, I'm actually the oldest one, so I get the privilege of describing who we are and the kind of work that we do to kind of just set the context for Larry, who will talk specifically about the major focus of this study, and then Larkin is going to talk about what we've learned to date. So Larkin, can you move the Here we go. So we are called the Global Psychiatric Epidemiology Group. When we were all a lot younger, we used to call ourselves the Child Psychiatric Epidemiology Group. But as you all know from your own experience, try as you will, the population and the individuals keep getting older, and we weren't able to stop that. So our child samples have all become adult samples. So although we still focus on children, many of our people that we study are now adults. So we changed our name, since we do a lot of work around the world, to the Global Psychiatric Epidemiology Group. And it's the emphasis of our research is always to do large-scale longitudinal studies, meaning we get a sample and we follow them off into the night. And that we have a large team, which is a multidisciplinary team. It's composed, as you can see here, epidemiology, psychiatry, geneticists, biostatisticians, etc. So just as the population is quite varied, any population that we look at, our team is also quite varied. And one of the major emphasis is on trauma and disaster. So we have a lot of cohorts that we've been following, both nationally and internationally, that are looking at the consequences of experiences in childhood that are not necessarily conducive to good outcomes. Larkin, you want to go to the next one? So just to give you a sense of the work that we do national and international work. And as a good Columbia graduate, you, like us, probably always thinking about the consequences of social injustice. So one of the things that we always try to emphasize in our work is social justice and health disparities. So we have, at the moment, we're involved in 3 large COVID studies, and they're all, to one extent or another, looking at the disparities. And we realized that back in March of 2020, that the pandemic was in fact going to generate, was going to lift the veil of a lot of the disparities in our society. So we've built that into all of the studies, and we're looking at it. So again, you can see here, our primary focus is to look at adverse experiences of childhood, be it trauma, disaster, or now COVID-19. And a lot of our work is on the suicide, which of course is a culmination of a lot of traumatic experiences for many people. So for example, we have a study right now looking at the whole country of Guyana. It's a small English-speaking country in South America. And it has the 3rd highest rates of suicide in the world. So we have the pleasure of working with PAHO and the National Ministry of Health to try to help them figure out why that is the case, why they have the highest rates in the world of young girls and older people. We did a similar study in Tajikistan, again, another small country in Central Asia, and we were brought in by WHO to help them figure out why they had a dramatically increasing rate of suicide. And as you can see on the screen there, we do a lot of funding from all branches of the National Institute of Health, the European Union, UNICEF. We're not proud. We take money from anyone. And sometimes it's very hard to find money to fund what we want to do. For example, we started the first COVID study in March of 2020 with no money. We did the study after 9/11, started on the 12th of September with no money. So one of the things that we pride ourselves on is doing what's important, regardless of the money, and hopefully the money will follow. And usually it does. Sometimes we're stuck, but that's the nature of trying to do good science at the right time. You can't wait for the money. So Larkin. So these just to remind you of the kinds of things you learned in school. What does it mean to have good methodology to do epidemiological studies? For us, it means longitudinal design. So from day one, like the study we're going to talk about here today, we think about what do we need to know today because of what it might mean 10 years from now. Our group actually has a 75-year plan. So we're always thinking really longitudinal. What is it going to mean when we look at these same subjects in 75 years and 10 years or 20 years? Because we're primarily interested in children, we have a developmental focus. So we always try to look at, how does that translate into a person's behavior today or tomorrow? We try to do representative sampling just because that has the most salience when you try to understand populations, whether it's the population of college-age students or it's a minority sample or whatever it is. We want it to be representative, so when we're done, it means something to more people than just our sample. Unlike a lot of epidemiological studies, we make it a point to always include families. People do not live as independent agents. They live as part of a context, and the context for most people is their family. The other thing that we do is we always try to match controls so that when we're done, we're always able to say, this is what it looks like in this population, but these are matched samples, so we know how different they are from people who didn't have the experience. In our case, it's usually trauma or disaster. We usually do face-to-face interviews. We have started with this COVID doing telephone interviews and online surveys out of necessity, but that's not our history. We try to do, as Larkin pointed out earlier, we're trying to understand from a more complex perspective what it is that makes up the reasons for these differences that we find in people. So we take a biopsychosocial approach. We're looking at biological markers, we're looking at psychological symptoms, etc. And we also try to contextualize what we're trying to understand. Are people living in poverty, or are they living in a penthouse on the 50th floor? What is the context of a person's behavior? What is the school? What is the home? And necessarily to do a longitudinal study and to have a 75-year plan, you need to have a life course perspective. And as we say, it's not only the study subjects that we work with once they get into our studies, they're with us for life, but we also say that about the staff. So you can see what's happened to Dr. Amsel. He came as a young man, and now you can see he's transformed. But it was a life course perspective, so he's part of the group for the long term. So the question could be, what was the impetus for doing COVID-19? Well, we know about we've been studying disaster, and we could easily see that this was going to be a major disaster. It was going to have consequences for mental health, suicide, substance use, etc. We also know that for the college study, this is a pivotal age, and we can expect any of these things to be exacerbated, whether it's substance use or hopefully not suicide, but that's certainly one of the things that we are looking at. But we also know that this is an age of critical life decisions. I mean, we can all look back at ourselves and say, how did I get to where I am today? I'm an engineer, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, I'm a school teacher. How did I get here? And what were those pivotal decisions? And many of them were during the college years. And we were all fortunate to be at Columbia during some of those years. And we know that there were professors who took us in a different direction than we thought we might be going. And then, of course, the public health impact. What are the public health impact of the COVID-19? I mean, we have just begun to scratch the surface of what those things mean. But we wanted to know, what does it mean for a college to try to serve this population? What do they need to know? What do they want to know? And maybe they don't want to know so much about the potential suicide in the student populations. Maybe they don't want to know about the problems that students have when they return back home and their parents are mentally ill or disabled, or they live in utter poverty, and the students were very grateful to get to college because they escaped that. So we want to know about those things so that we can inform the colleges and the universities so that hopefully they can take a different perspective of the student body. And then the question about institutional policies. So we all heard, we heard our new president talking about how he wants to have free junior colleges and state colleges. Everybody can go free, but there was a slight slap at the private colleges. Well, what does it mean for institutions when we have this kind of direction from the government? What does it mean for the students? And we need to talk about all of these different things from a health perspective, from a public health perspective. So that's what we're doing and why we do it. That's the shape of our group. And you're going to hear two people who are figuring out what we're actually doing. So Larry?
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm so glad so many of you chose to spend the evening with us. When Larkin and Dr. Hoven got together, and they were, for the reasons that Dr. Hoven just explained, they realized that it was really important. Together, they realized it was really important that we try to understand what's going on with college students. That they, a lot of people were going to be affected in different ways, but college students were going to be in a pivotal moment in their lives, and it was really important to study them. Dr. Hoven knew that I was interested in decision making, and it was her insight that one of the important things at this stage of people's lives to try to understand is, as their lives are being turned upside down by COVID, how are they making decisions? How are they handling this and making decisions? And so she asked me to join the study team and to bring my knowledge of decision-making processes and how they're measured to the study, so we could not only understand things like depression and more alcohol, less alcohol use, but also how basic life decisions were being made. So I want to talk for a moment about this, about a kind of a whole science that has really grown up in the last 20 years. And it's the science of decision making, but you also may have heard it under the rubric of behavioral economics. And what these are is these are tools for understanding how people make decisions, but they're also tools for improving how people make decisions and getting people to make better decisions. Larkin, next slide, please. So what is decision making? Well, it's been my interest, and you know, when something is your interest, you think it's everything, but I do think it's everything. I think it's the emperor of cognitive functions. I think that when you think about decision making, it is absolutely the most important of all the cognitive functioning. Because if you think about all the rest of cognitive functioning, visual processing, audio processing, all of those, they all are in the service of making decisions. It is really what, at the end of the day, what we have to do is make decisions and make wise decisions that keep us safe and alive. So, and also, if you think in terms of evolutionary time, evolution selects on creatures that make good decisions. The creatures that are making good decisions, decisions that that lead to actions that help their survival, those are the creatures that survive, and the creatures that make bad decisions don't survive. So we should all be fantastic decision makers, but that doesn't quite work out that way yet. We'll explain why. Now, the mark of conscious life is the capacity to decide, and decisions have these three aspects. I make a decision in the present. I make that decision in anticipation of the future. I decide I'm going to stay up late tonight and study for this exam because it's going to help me get a good grade, which will help me get a good letter of recommendation, which will help me get a job. And I do all of those things in light of past experience, because I've had a good experience last semester that if I studied hard for my exam, that I would do well. So decision-making, even if decision-making takes place in the present, it always involves the past experience, which tells me what's important, and it involves the future, because I'm making decisions for my future. It's also interesting that we usually assign the cause of behavior to their outcomes, which leads you in something called a teleological process. So if you ask somebody why they went to the ice cream store, they'll tell you they went to the ice cream store to get chocolate ice cream. The problem is that getting chocolate ice cream happens after you went to the store. So there's something called the teleological process, where the cause of our actions take place after our actions. And that's what's called the teleological process. And what it is it's actually kind of what at the heart of what is motivation, right? Motivation is something that I'm doing something because I know it will have a result, and the result is what causes me to do it. So that's, I think, for these kinds of reasons, decision-making and behavioral economics, which is one of the latest sciences of decision-making, I find them so fascinating. Now, what is behavioral economics specifically within the decision-making world? Well, it's the reuniting of economics and psychology. And here I'm going to speak from 10,000 feet. Anyone could pick an argument with any of these particular points, but I'm trying to paint a large picture. And if you paint a large picture, then economics assumes people are rational, whereas psychology assumes people are emotional or focuses on the emotion. Behavioral economics unites the economic models, which were based on rationality, and empirical psychology. Empirical psychology measures people's actual behaviors, which often includes very emotional and non-rational aspects. Decision-making is something that they have in common because psychology and economics have always had decision-making as a common interest. Obviously, economists are interested in decision-making. Price points, all of that depends on individual decision-making, individual preferences. Decision-making is central to economics, and it's also central to the psychology of motivation. So behavioral economics noticed this and put them together. And what does behavioral economics propose? It proposes that people are sort of rational, that there are a lot of rational aspects to the way we behave, but there are deviations from rationality. And what's so interesting is that those deviations are predictable. I think many of you might be familiar with a popular book by Dan Ariely called Predictably Irrational, which is one of the more amusing books on behavioral economics. And it talks about how our irrational behavior may be irrational, but it may also be quite predictable because there are specific ways. We're not irrational in all ways. There are specific things that put us off the completely rational track, and those are not always a bad decisions when they're not completely rational. Many decisions made involving love are not completely rational, but they're good decisions nonetheless. So behavioral economics reunites economics and psychology. There's an idea in behavioral economics which is called choice architecture, and the idea that choice architecture matters as much as outcome. That sounds a little abstract. What does that mean? Well, framing is a good idea. One example of what choice architecture is that depending on how a choice is presented to you, how it's framed, you may make a very different choice, even though the actual choice is the same. So let's look at a very concrete and kind of startling example. This is old data. This was from about 10, I think it's about 15 years old now, but it's very important that this existed at that moment. Organ donation in Germany was 12%. And in Austria, right next to it, was 99%. What was the difference? Well, it wasn't a difference between whether people wanted to donate organs or not. That's the same choice. That's the same outcome. The difference was the way the question was presented. In Austria, it was an opt-out. In other words, the assumption was that you're going to donate your organ. And you only could not donate the organ by actually filling out a form and saying, I don't want to donate my organ. And 99% of people chose to stick with the status quo, which was, I'm going to donate my organ. That's what was done. Whereas in Germany, you had to sign, like in America now, you had to sign something. You had to opt in. And they had to sign in. So 12%, only 12% of people did that. Now, surveys showed that people had about the same attitude, but the actual way they made their decision was so different because of the architecture of the way the choice was presented. That's what's called choice architecture. Now, a number of companies are doing the same sort of thing with their HR departments in terms of having people make donations to their retirement funds and changing them from opt-in, where you have to proactively opt in, to a default. And it turns out that people are doing a lot better on savings because of that. So if it's true that these choice architectures are going to make a big difference, what can we do about them? Well, the behavioral economists have come up with a nice word, and it's called nudge. And the idea of nudge is, it's to redesign the choice architecture so that you nudge people in the right direction. So a trivial example of nudge would be that if you had a school cafeteria, instead of having the hamburgers be the first thing, you have all of the vegetables and all of the fruits and all of the healthy stuff the beginning part of the lake, and then you have the other stuff later. That will change the choice architecture, and it ends up helping kids make healthier decisions. Another example is the one I just mentioned before, making organ donation a default when somebody applies for their driver's license, and forcing people to opt out rather than opt in. So nudges are ways of changing the decision architecture, even though the choice is really the same. The underlying choice is the same, but the way it's presented can be different and nudge us in healthier directions. Next chart, next slide. So what have been some example of nudges that have been used or proposed for COVID-19 behaviors, right? So one example is coming out of London was appealing to something called the bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect is people will tend to do something if they think most of their colleagues or most of their friends are doing it. So what they did was, instead of having a sign that said, wash your hands, they had a sign that said, most of your health worker colleagues perform regular hand hygiene. Will you join them? Are you in this category? So what they used is that they changed the presentation of the choice to wash your hands and turned it into a choice. You know, do you belong to the healthy majority of your colleagues? So that's called appealing to the bandwagon effect. Another thing is an appeal to loss aversion. This I think we're more familiar with, but and this existed before behavioral economics, but behavioral economists have latched onto this thing, which is to appeal to people's loss aversion. People don't like to experience loss, and if you emphasize that increasing hand hygiene will decrease their loss, it decreases their chance of getting an infection. So again, rather than come at it from this very finger waving thing, you explain to people in the poster what is the benefit for them. The benefit is decrease in infection. The social distancing nudge there've been a lot of very interesting things that we see all around that are nudges. For example, the little things pasted on the floor that show you what the 6 foot thing. Those fall into the category of nudges because they change your decision architecture. Instead of saying, oh my God, where am I going to stand? How do I do 6 feet? All you have to do is say, oh, I can stand on this yellow circle or not stand on it. And most people will choose to stand on it. So it makes the choice much easier. There's also a phone app that was tried in England. This was experimented with, and it was a phone app in which everybody in a certain circle would have the same phone app, and if you got within 6 feet, your phone would beep. So the phone became the reminder of how close you were to somebody else, anybody else in that circle, and would keep you at a 6 feet distance. Finally, there's something called the availability heuristic, and that again, that is something that reduces the cognitive effort. So in making a choice, sometimes I want to make the right choice, but the right choice is much harder than the easy choice. I have to do a lot more steps, and the idea is make it just as easy to do the right thing as the wrong thing. Make masks very easily available. Make those choices very available. Don't make them be something confusing and something that people have to reinvent themselves. So that's the availability heuristic, is make the right choice the easy one to do. Let's see the next slide. Now, there are individual differences in decision making, and one of the bases, one of the foundations for the individual differences are something called differences in moral foundation. And I think a lot of you are familiar with people who have some interest in ethical decision making, are familiar with the distinction between utilitarian, which is the most good for the most people, and deontologic perspectives. Deontologic perspectives means an ethics based on some things are just bad, no matter what the consequences are, good or bad, whatever the consequences are, it's just bad thing to do. And growing up based on these things, which were very traditional ethical concepts, we had work by Jonathan Haidt. Many of you might be familiar with him, his books about what are the political. He's done very foundational work in what are the political differences across the country, and in some of the struggles that are going on in the universities. And what he did was to lay out these foundational aspects of what are the moral foundations of our decision making. And he came up with these after doing, there's actually a couple thousand pieces of research that this is based on. And he came up with these 5: the care, the cherishing and protecting of others as a value, fairness as a value, loyalty or in-group as a value, authority as a value, and sanctity as a value. So anybody reading this might say, those are all wonderful things. I agree with all of those. And yes, we all agree with all of those. But what Jonathan has shown is that the importance of each of them, the relative importance, what happens when loyalty conflicts with sanctity, or when fairness conflicts with care, which choice are you going to make? Which one of these you prioritize? And depending on which one of these you prioritize in conflict, it can help us predict what kinds of choices you'll make. And it's unevaluative. Nobody's saying one person is better than another because they value loyalty over fairness, or they value care more than sanctity. But it does tell us about the structure, the underlying structure of your decision-making approaches. Next. So one of the reasons that Dr. Hoven mentioned that one of the goals of our thing was to let universities have some more information, because universities were quite at a loss at the beginning of COVID, and they still are at quite of a loss, because they're sort of trying to make their best estimates based on what they know in pre-COVID times about what their students need. But the idea is Dr. Hoven wanted to drill down very, very specifically and find out not only what students generically need, but maybe different students need different things. Maybe different kinds of students need different things. And so she had the idea we have to find out what their decision-making style is, because that is going to tell us what their needs are. And the colleges are going to have to tailor some of their actions to the particular styles of the particular students. They're not going to have an effective one-size-fits-all. Now, many of you have had the experience where a financial advisor asks you about your decision-making style. You may say, oh, Dr. Amsel, you talk about decision-making. That seems very abstract and far from my experience, but it's not. If you've ever talked to a financial advisor, the first thing they do is ask you, what's your risk tolerance, right? I remember that was a very uncomfortable question when they asked me what my risk tolerance is. But if they're going to tailor, and you say, well, why do you need to know that? And they'll always explain to you that if they're going to tailor the right investments plan for you, they have to know your decision-making style, because as things move up and down, people who have low risk tolerance are not going to be able to do the right thing if they're highly invested in risky stocks, let's say. So an investing strategy depends on these individualized differences, and so do many college choices. The choices of which major I should take, whether I should take student loans, my grade curating, that is to say whether I'm taking courses in order to get good grades, or I'm taking courses because they're going to help my career. All of these things have a lot to do with what your risk tolerance is and your other decision-making things, as we said, your values list and those kinds of things. So, for example, if you know that somebody is very, very sensitive to regret, then appealing to the loss aversion is going to be a very important thing. Pointing out to them that certain kinds of behaviors, right, are going to lead to certain kinds of losses will be an effective strategy for someone who has regret as a motivator, but not someone who's a high risk taker. Another very important decision-making individual difference, an individual difference in decision-making, is the present bias and delay discounting. And that is the ability to manage long-term planning and the ability to postpone gratification. I imagine by now, most people in the audience are familiar with the famous Marshmallow Experiment, in which they showed that if they test young kids, 5 to 7, if they test their ability to forego eating the marshmallow for 5 minutes, because they say if you do that, Jane, you are going to have 3 marshmallows in 10 minutes. Well, Jane was very good, and she waited and she got the 3 marshmallows. And if that was the case, then Jane also did very good on her SATs, got into a good university and got a good job. The predictive ability of this study, which was done by We recently lost the first author of that study, but the predictive ability of this study was really quite remarkable, because it demonstrated the ability. So we have a version of this which is called delay discounting, which doesn't talk about marshmallows, but it talks about you get offered different amounts of money at different times. Would you rather take $1 today or $2 in a week? So it's the same sort of thing, same sort of experiment done for adults, and it tells me how people make choices and use the future versus the present in terms of their gratification and ability to postpone gratification. This will predict substance abuse. It predicts anorexia. It actually has turned out to be quite central in many psychiatric issues and in a lot of life decision making. So next slide. So once we have done this, and once we have been able to ascertain that different kids have different young students have different decision-making styles, we will be able to target the right intervention and make sure that the college is supporting the individual needs, right? Some kids, for example, have greater need for social decision-making, that they're focused more on fairness and community. Others have more of what we call a need for cognition and a low tolerance for uncertainty. They need a lot of information. So if you knew, for example, which kids had a large need for cognition, you could tailor messages so that the kids who had large need for cognition could get a longer version of some important memo, and the other kids could get a shorter version of the memo with the option. And that it would be much more effective at getting the communication across. All right, next slide.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry. And once again, we really appreciate the opportunity to tell you a little bit about our research team and our study, the college COVID study that we're undertaking, as well as to share some of the preliminary findings. But first, I would be remiss if I did not publicly acknowledge and profusely thank our partners and collaborators, both in academic and health student organizations that have really been able to help us not only during a pandemic pull together and launch a study, but also recruit the participants for the study. So we look forward to strengthening these important relationships as we start to look at interpreting and disseminating the findings, so that ultimately schools and policies that are relevant policies can be better address the needs that students are expressing while they're participating in our survey. So like most everything in the past year, it's an online survey, but we would like to highlight kind of how our study is unique and what we would consider value added to what the other great work that's been doing to address and identify the needs for college age individuals. So we really had the underlying principle that we wanted this to not just be a study asking about, are you feeling depressed and anxious, or overall, stress, but we really wanted to push the envelope to get the full picture, as Christina alluded to from our other work that we do of trauma or just disaster exposed individuals, is that there's a context, and it's not just one aspect of life, but it's their academic, it's their relationship, it's their economic. It's very much a multi-faceted influences of things that are not only influencing their mental health and other aspects of behavioral health, but also the decisions they're making. I mean, the one thing that the pandemic has, the hallmark of the pandemic, is that it's just generated this overwhelming sense of uncertainty. And as Larry described just a few minutes ago, is that we still all have to make decisions. And so we really wanted to know in our study is about how that underlying decision-making profile is influencing the associations between one student's pandemic experience, which could be defined in a multitude of ways, and their health outcomes, not only mental health, but also other health behaviors. And then that's the short term, but then ultimately how that's going to help influence important life decisions, where it be academic, relationship, pre-professional and employment one. So we wanted the full develop, as Christina said, the 75-year plan of examining the impact of this pandemic on these students' lives. So that's the component of having the decision-making aspects measures in our study. I think it's quite unique. Another unique factor of our study is, unlike others, we ask the hard questions, the direct question of suicidal ideation and behavior. All three of us, Larry, Christina, and I, and many in our group, are rooted in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia. So we feel almost an obligation to be able to provide or at least assist with the linkage of referral for those who are going to report on our study. So we have established a connection with a national crisis counseling center with Boys Town, that those who indicate that they are imminently reporting suicidality, that students are informed that they will receive a proactive outreach from the counseling center to follow up. That being said, our school and student recruitment is still open. We welcome partners. The recruitment approach has been two ways. One, as learned out of the necessity of trying to do a national study in a pandemic, and recruitment is not for the faint of heart. Obviously, academic institutions have probably more pressing priorities that they were having to address, i.e. moving students off campus, transitioning to online learning, as well as COVID testing and retesting. So we partnered with the Association of American Colleges and Universities for their assistance for sending out a national plea to their members of their roster, which was filled with quite a representative display of academic institutions in the United States. And then we also, given the population and their let's say preference to way of communication is via social media, that we've also incorporated a direct student recruitment through Instagram, Facebook, and that's also seen uptick in responses. So just to give you a glimpse of some examples of the content of our survey, and to give you a clear picture how comprehensive it is. Generally, the areas fall in three domains. One is a description, a full body description of their pandemic experience. So that might be to the actual virus itself, for self or family, friends, those within and beyond the household. Also related to the experience could be their academic, transitions. Just some people opt for a gap semester, a gap year. Did they change schools? Have they changed the focus? Is something about the pandemic changing the focus of their major? We have some measures that are asking about their perceived transition or to online learning and their general satisfaction with that, as well as changing of what they feel that the perception of the institutional messaging they got from their school about not only the transition to online, but any assistance and need-based care that they received from their school during the pandemic. So we also have things that are measures asking about changes to daily life, whether that be where they're living or who they're living with, but also changes in their behaviors, the relationships, the changes in their use of screen time, not only how long they're on it, but what they're using it for, as well as changes to daily living, sleeping, eating habits, and exercise. So then there's also very much a focus on those measures related to employment and finances, job loss for those themselves, as well as parents, as well as ability to pay for basic needs, food, shelter, and so we've included important measures related to those. And of course, the focus of being on changes to their health and health behaviors, anxiety, depression, suicidality and self-injury, but also beyond that, and including substance use, but really assessing these more, important things that you could develop interventions for as related to agoraphobia, panic, loneliness, post-traumatic stress symptoms, and general use of functional impairment, as well as their use of school-based and non-school-based services and their perceived satisfaction with those services. So, and then also the subcategory of decision-making and value orientation that Larry provided a good justification for. So who do we have in our sample today is actually quite remarkable given the different styles of recruitment, that it's actually more or less reflective of a general population of U.S. students in degree-seeking universities, with the one exception, which I think is true for most online surveys, is that females tend to participate more. But I think also important, which makes us a little more unique than other studies that have been out there, and in part related to our partnering with the AAC&U, is that we also have a substantial representation of community colleges students. And so I think that's important, especially as we've seen the disproportionate fallout of not only primary but secondary consequences of the pandemic. That might be more reflective of students who are attending community colleges versus, 2- and 4-year schools. But overwhelmingly, they're full-time students with 83%. About half are receiving student financial aid. And I think what's also given our goal of the 75-year plan is that we're seeing about over 2/3 that are willing, after they've completed this long 30 to 45-minute survey, to be invested and want to participate in future follow-up surveys. So the preliminary findings that I want to share with you right now, and hopefully I hope these will generate not only Larry's conversation, but the findings that I'll show, is food for thought for question and answers following this, which will hopefully provide for a stimulating discussion for us all. But there's a couple of key hallmarks that we've focused on, and we're seeing in these early days of looking at the data, is that first and foremost that the financial stress that students are feeling right now are real, and that it may be for a certain subgroup of lower SES or across key institutional characteristics may not be, or may be disproportionately being experienced. But whether, and these are three examples of, kind of proxies for financial stress, is how much at the end of each month did my household generally end up with enough funds to make ends meet. And we can see there's a key group of 14%. Not only is it increased from before the pandemic started in March, but that it's disproportionately higher among those students who are attending community college. But as we've heard, if you might have heard more national press, overall the pandemic has really uncovered a true concern about food insecurity in the United States. And here for this college age group, this is a very real experience that we have, no matter where they're going, community college or 2- or 4-year school, is that, having 10 to 15% or 17% experiencing not enough ability to have, a daily substance of food is a concern. And where this intersects with colleges is that might be a prime conduit of giving them access to good source of food. And then we asked about how concerned have you been about being evicted or losing your home due to foreclosure. So this taps the construct of residential stability. And you can see we have about, we're seeing about 14% in the two higher end of somewhat or extremely concerned about being displaced, and that it's almost double that in the community colleges compared to students attending 2- and 4-year schools. So some other additional indicators of financial stress is job loss. So whether it be their own or their parents, it ranges from 10 to 15 to 20% that, experienced a absolute loss of employment. But beyond that, even having hours significantly reduced because of the pandemic has really been, is seen by over, about a third of college students. And this, when we asked about how much do you in general feel that the pandemic has financially impacted your family or you, we have 30% that are saying it's impacted their family's finances a lot. One of those ways that you can measure that is saying, even of the really basic needs, food, clothing, medical care, housing, how often does your household have to put off those basic needs? And so we had some measures of thinking about the year prior to the pandemic, around 10%, 12%, 13%, but now it's almost a 10% increase for these students. And while the students who were reporting from community colleges were higher to begin with, both before and since the pandemic, we do see that no matter whether it's a community college or the 2 to 4 year students, that it's about a 1.5% increase. I mean, a 1.5-fold increase now than it was prior to the pandemic. So I think that definitely exemplifies that financial stress is huge for college students right now. So some other aspects that, if our objective was that we want to be able to inform institutions about how they can respond, let's see, what are the students' perceptions about how they did of messaging? So we looked at how effective was the school about communicating this plan. And you can see there was a lot of confusion about the transition to online learning. But, I think that was that you have to remember the context of how that transitioning was happening. It was in a very confusing type of time in and of itself. But on the upside, this age group has the means by which to do online learning, meaning they have a computer, and most often that computer is their own. So they're not, unlike grade school kids, they're not having to share with 3 or 4 other brothers and sisters. But when you get to rubber meets the road, is that the reliability of their internet connection is very much a concern, where we have almost 10% that are saying, I don't have it at all. And then another 50, 60% that are saying it's not great. So that complicates not only the ability to, it complicates the ability to participate in this mode of education. And when thinking about the ease of the online platform, whether it be Zoom or WebEx or all the other multitude of ones that were out there to begin with, you can see 30%, 25% a quarter were having like extreme or moderate, really, difficulty in making that transition of figuring out how it worked. So that was all, also in the beginning. I know everyone in academic institutions alike have really put a lot of energy into helping their instructors become better online educators. But let's just keep in mind, and I think it's the important thing, no matter whether you have the means or the ability of connectivity or how confusing you felt it, is that 62% are saying that they had, they strongly agreed with the statement, I'm easily distracted with during online instruction. So no matter what the world is going on, that they're still distracted while they're trying to be educated. That's something that academic leadership needs to keep in mind. So like a lot of studies that have examined the impact on mental health in college age individuals, is that we're seeing much high elevated rates of anxiety and depression. A little differently and unique that our study can provide, as opposed to, right after the bomb dropped, in March, is that we are seeing these elevated rates be much higher, even almost a year into the pandemic. Some might say after a trauma or a disaster, that rates obviously are elevated and spiked, but then they tend after a couple of months to wane down. And from others who have looked at this, including ours, that we're not seeing that they're still at elevated rates. So another major concern we knew for this age group, but even before the pandemic, is that suicide is the second leading cause of death among 18 to 24-year-olds. And then if you further look at it, 18 to 24-year-olds who are in college, it's very much extreme concern. So in the CDC recently had put out a report that looked at, in June of last year, so a couple months into it, what was the rate of in the previous 30 days of serious suicide ideation. So not necessarily an attempt, but really thinking about it in the past month. And the highest reporting, the rates were highest for this college age group of 25%. So we've asked about it many ways of thinking about, wishing you were dead, or thinking about your family think you're better off dead, or that you had thoughts about killing yourself. What's your lifetime, attempt rate, as well as those who've attempted in the past year. So I think two takeaways from this slide are to say is that we do see some elevation among females, but usually we see a little bit higher in epidemiological studies. However, what we're really concerned with now is that it seems that males for more immediate and what they would call imminent risk for suicidal behavior seems elevated among males. So in terms of substance use, we're focused on how is this pandemic, given it's all anxiety and the financial stress and and other stress-related things to online educational changes, how's that impacting their substance use? Because we know that if you have a student that's not or having excess substance use, that it creates problems and influences their ability to learn. But here we see some, overall marijuana and alcohol use has increased more than it's decreased since the pandemic. So what that is, the red bars is the increased use, or a little bit higher than the green bars, the decreased use. And interestingly enough, we see another kind of discrepancy or difference across key institutional characteristic of whether community college or attending a 2 to 4 year, where it's the higher rates of increased use are among community college students, and that's flipped for alcohol, the increased use of alcohol and marijuana, which is more, the increased use is more prevalent among those students attending a 2 or 4 year school. Regarding their use and satisfaction with services, I think there's, definitely some glass half full things here, is that a third are reporting that or 27% are reporting that they're currently seeing somebody about a behavioral or substance use problem. So you do have some subgroup that's actually having addressed mental health or substance use needs. Before the pandemic, 30% reported having used student health services. And if they did, they were very overwhelmingly satisfied with those services that they received. Unfortunately, looking at the use of services now is around 12% of those responding to our survey. However, I think that might, be artificially deflated because a lot of these students aren't on campuses to use those services. So when we further ask of those that did use, what are they using it for? Overwhelmingly, they're using it for COVID-related things, getting tested, or I guess some of the symptoms related to headache and the like, stomach. Then the other is a good portion that are also using it for general health, services, colds, the flu shot, reproductive condoms availability. Good to hear that just a little less than that are using it for COVID or general health are also using it for mental health aspects. But what I think is the concern here is too, given those, the concern about problematic drinking and drug use, that they're not using it for substance use services. So again, schools might want to use that as a stepping stone to thinking of the services they do provide. What's the different types of including substance use services with that. And then, but we think about just asking them, how do you think this has, do you think you need to see somebody about their feelings, about the COVID-19 pandemic? And we do see a substantial, almost 1/5 are saying that they think they need to see somebody. So giving them just some takeaways before we have some discussion here is, what are students thinking about how this is impacting their lives, just the short term and the long term? And I think these 3 statistics make it pretty evident. The top 2 being very disparagingly that, you have over 1/3 that are saying they very much feel, the pandemic has ruined their college experience. And then you have half that are saying, the world's not going to, go back to normal after the pandemic. We are the new normal. But I think also at the same time, we have 70%, which is overwhelming, almost a majority, that are agreeing or strongly agreeing with the statement that I always feel hopeful about my future. So when we think, a lot of conversations in our research group has really been about, this group of college students and this generation really have an opportunity to demonstrate their resiliency, maybe learning firsthand that sometimes, as we all know, having lived experience, is that it's not very often that life goes in a straight line as planned. So maybe they will take away from this that experience. The next step, as I mentioned, the baseline survey is still open and will be open till the end of spring, where we have a planned series of data updates beyond just examining important gender and ethnic differences, that we also plan to compare on some of these key institutional characteristics, as I showed here with the comparisons between community colleges and students attending 2- and 4-year schools. And we also very much want to focus on, the aspect of decision-making profiles and architecture and their risk adversity or non-adversity, and how that's mediating or making the connection between one's lived pandemic experience and all that entails, and their health outcomes and academic life decisions going forward. And as the longitudinal nature of our group, we plan for future follow-up surveys. So if there's schools or students that are interested, we can definitely, if anybody wants to get a hold of me, I think these will go out with the slides, but you can email me, call me, and we'd be happy to partner with academic institutions and other student organizations groups. So again, thank you. This doesn't happen in a vacuum without many partners contributing during a pandemic, in themselves. But we really appreciate everyone's time. So those are the end of our slides. And we open this up for anybody. I'll have to look in the chat to see if there's questions. You can either write them in the chat, or we'd be happy to answer.
Hi, doctors. Thank you so much. I'm the Columbia admin for the DC alumni group here. My name is Miyako. So I can go ahead and read the questions out to you. If you can decide kind of who's best suited to answer each question, that would be great. But we had a question come in on kind of how you decided on the age of the students. I know it's a really important age range in college. You're just becoming an adult. You're still kind of, framing how you make decisions. But did you think about including kind of the other end, so either high school or graduate students?
Right. Well, I think definitely we didn't, it's not a, we felt more important to be inclusive of the type of institution. Most often when these national surveys are conducted, they are done for better or not, to the exclusion of community college and systems. And we know that dictates that you'll have a beyond a traditional 18 to 24 age group. So we, that was our focus. I don't know if anybody else had on the panel.
Yeah, let me try to, because we did talk about this quite a bit, whether we should try to include, because this was in the late spring, summer, and should we try to include the students? But the experience of a high school student living at home, we knew was very different than being thrown out of the dorm with a 24-hour notice. And we also wanted to have the seniors, because the seniors would be going out into the world, and what was that world going to be like for them, and how were they going to be viewing their college experience? So it's always attractive to try to do everything, but you have to focus. And so we focused on those 4 years, and we included the junior college because that's a particularly important subset of college population. It also includes a lot of older people. And we also thought, and it turns out that it was a correct idea, that many students in four-year colleges after the pandemic, during the pandemic, would choose to stay home and go to their local community college as opposed to going back to their institution. So we wanted to get that population. It's, Larry's famous for talking about how do you make choices. Doing research, that's what you have to do every step of the way. So you finally settle on what makes the most appropriate sample. So that's how we settled that.
And then given that you have some preliminary findings, we had a question that, on some of those slides that you had, there was about 700 responses, different questions had different number of responses.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about the numbers that you've gotten so far? How long is it going to go? When do you expect to submit results? And how do you expect them to change over time? Or do you think you have a good sample now?
Great question. And this actually, I didn't have time to go into it in detail in this group, but we knew our survey was going to be very comprehensive, and we knew that there was ultimately going to be a limit of how much we could include. So we employed a design that was actually utilized in Christina's 9/11 study, is where you can do a three-panel data missing design, where a third of the group will get 2/3 of the questions, and then there's a core that everybody gets, and that way that explains why some of the sample sizes for the different slides is because 1/3 of the group didn't get asked those questions ultimately. But we have the important things all contained, exposures and outcomes contained in the core panel.
I think she was also asking how many people we had, how many we plan to have, and how long we're going to keep this going.
So right now we have around 1,000 respondents, and it's, now that we've moved more recently in the past couple weeks to social media, some days we get 400 and others there's 2. So we have learned that partnering with schools who will send out a school-wide email to their whole student body is probably the most efficient and gets the bigger bang for the buck in terms of survey response. But that said, schools are still, very much preoccupied with the pandemic.
Yeah, for example, different schools have a different response, although they all say it's a great idea and they want to participate. Even institutions like our own, Columbia University, Columbia College, is concerned because of the strike that's going on. So they don't want to take a position. So different schools have different reasons, although they tell us we want to do this, but for some reason, they're reluctant at the time. So it's like everything related to the pandemic. You have to work with the audience. So we're very hopeful of getting Columbia on, but there's a strike going on. So it complicates things. That's life.
And I think I saw that you're still accepting submissions through the summer. Do you expect to have finalized results? I mean, obviously you have some now, but around the early fall, maybe?
Yes, we'll have a lot of results by the early fall. And Larry will be doing the analysis on the profiles for the decisions and stuff. So, like, we ask a question about, we have a trolley question, for example. So some of these things we don't, who you want to throw onto the tracks and stuff, but, we don't want to do some of those analyses prematurely. So we're holding off, but we do hope this summer that we will be able to generate a number of very compelling papers. Mm-hmm.
And we've had a couple of questions and comments where people have noticed that some students have chosen to drop out of school for a semester or more.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are going into the workforce who've never worked before, and maybe they're a little bit less risk averse than older alumni. So have you seen anything about kind of what makes that decision for the students to drop out of school and start the workforce? And then also, have you seen anything from the school side if they'll readmit students after semester or year of leave? How might that work out?
We wouldn't be able to answer that question about schools. It's a very interesting one. And I think schools are all grappling with that very question, which is part of why the schools are so interested in our data. But the question about students dropping out, that's precisely why we get everyone's personal email and personal telephone number and personal address so that we can follow them up for the 75-year plan. They're hopefully not going to be stuck in the same 4-year institution for the next 75 years, but we want to be able to follow them. And
we're still here.
We expect that a lot of them have dropped out, will go back, or they will change institutions for different reasons. They need to stay home. They can't travel. They don't want to travel. They want to save on costs, whatever it is. So we are hopeful over time, and we have an application to NIH to follow this cohort into the night, so that we in fact will be able to find out the kinds of decisions they made. Why did they decide not to go back to school? Why did they decide to leave that institution? The questions you ask about the institutions themselves are equally compelling. It's just not one that we're looking at.
Okay, we had a couple more questions about how you chose which groups to partner with. So somebody asked if you had considered partnering with the American College Health Association. They're a professional organization comprised of those who work on student health and well-being in higher education. And then there was another question about, did you think about partnering with health centers at the schools rather than the college administration?
Right. Well, I'll tell you the short answer for that is that it was a pandemic when we were pulling this together. And so being even to have someone pick up a phone or an email was difficult. But we had known that the ACHA would be doing this. They have an ongoing annual survey, and we knew that they would be doing almost like a supplement piece to this. But we couldn't imagine that anyone who was out there doing one, and it turns out to be true, would be as comprehensive and as on board to include this whole aspect of what we found very important of decision making. So you have to weigh the judgment of your partners there. The groups, and then I knew we had to have some way to connect with the institutions. So we thought who has probably the most representative roster of schools that might pick up a call during a very beginning stage of the pandemic.
The other part of it is that, if you work with the health system, you're going to get a biased sample. So one of the things that we didn't want was a biased sample. And there are lots of ways we could get that. We could work with the athletic league. They were very interested. But you end up then with a biased sample. So the only choice was to go from the top down and try to get as many people representing all the different facets of the college as we could.
We saw in some of your findings that you had quite a bit of outreach to mental health services, students feeling like they needed that. Mm-hmm. We had somebody write in and say that they and a lot of their colleagues work in mental health services, but their practices are full and they can't actually help the college kids who are coming to them. So I don't know if you can talk to that a little bit more. How are they accessing mental health services right now?
So a lot of schools are providing, and like most of healthcare groups, is telepsychiatry to address some of the expressed mental health and anxiety and depression with great success. I think that was quickly rolled out. But this brings to mind something. If you have an overwhelming group on your student body, on your campus, who have a need such as a mental health, then maybe you need to take a step back and think more broadly of doing a universal, not only primary prevention, but secondary prevention, which actually, given what we know regarding the stigma associated with receiving both mental health and substance use services, if it's universal, you might actually avoid some of that stigma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to add that we are not doing this study or most of our studies on an intervention basis. So, although we are collecting the data about service utilization and need and so forth, the one thing I'm always committed to is if there's any kind of suicidal thinking, that we intervene. And so we're very clear about that. And in fact, delayed the study for almost 3 months, trying to sort out how we would do a study in which people would have good follow-up with suicidal thinking. And that was a real problem. How do you find somebody in the outer reaches of Utah who's suicidal, and how do we then at Columbia be responsible? So that was a challenge, and as Larkin described earlier, we were able to do that so that everyone gets a phone call and followed up if they're suicidal from Boys Town. Now, I never would have thought of Boys Town as doing this, but this is what they do. It turns out that they run national hotlines, and they do this all over the country. We didn't know that until, that's why it took us 3 months to get started. We were trying to find the best, and it was actually NIH that referred us to Boys Town because they knew about it. We didn't know. So you have to be responsible, but there's always a limit to what you can do. And I think it is a problem, like some of the people in the audience saying that they weren't able to satisfy the need for college students. And that is a tragedy. That is a tragedy. But I think one of the outcomes of what has gone on in this pandemic is that people's awareness of the need for mental health services has certainly been highlighted. So hopefully moving forward with telemedicine and the campus outreach programs, we can all do better.
Yeah, certainly. In schools, there's a lot of expenses that schools don't have because, right? Because students are not on campus, and I think schools are actually going to have to think about reinvesting. And people think differently, but in my opinion, the first budget line when you think about student life, right, is not the swimming pool; it's the mental health access, right? So I think schools should really hopefully we can contribute to their seeing this. Will need to rethink their priorities in terms of mental health, and not only students who come to them saying that they have problems, but as Larkin mentioned, in proactive outreach programs, in sending out emails, educational programs, having short courses available on anxiety and on depression. People have some. People are much more knowledgeable now about these issues than they were maybe 20 years ago. But there's still a tremendous amount of ignorance about really just the basic ideas about anxiety and how it gets treated, and depression and how it gets treated, and just having that knowledge and making sure that every student, is aware of what their options are and how to self-recognize when they're having a problem. I think is really important.
Yeah,
having their friends recognize.
Larry and Larkin have heard me say this many times, but it's so powerful. We did a 11-country study in Europe of high school students, and we were trying to do a suicide prevention. And so it was a randomized controlled trial. And the trial that actually proved most effective, in fact, it's the most effective intervention in the literature, was an effort that we did with giving the students we created a small little booklet, and we put mental health in there, and we made it user-friendly for the children. We used all of the DSM and so forth. And we then had only a 1 hour role play session with the students. And ultimately, over 12 months, we reduced suicidal behavior by 50%, far better than any of the other interventions. Now all of these things are always limited because you never have money to follow them up. But the interesting thing about that intervention is that when we came back 12 months later to do the assessments, we found many of the students had that little notebook that we've created all crumpled up, and it was still in their backpack. They were still carrying it around 12 months later. They were using it, and it was giving them very simple instructions. It's very common among young people to be suicidal and then tell their friend, tonight's the night. But you're my best friend and you won't tell anybody, right? And so your best friend says, no, of course I'm not. The next day you're dead, right? Well, what you have to get people to understand, if you're really the best friend, you will contact somebody. You will get them help. That's a very simple conversation to have. But if you don't have it, the person doesn't know. Now, you not only have the dead child, you've got the other child living for the rest of their life knowing that they betrayed their friend because they didn't tell. You can get rid of all of that by talking about it and giving people very simple tools. So this notion of the role of schools and the responsibility they have when they take on locus parentis, what does that mean? You have obligations, but you also have readily available tools. You may not want to spend the money. Well, I think you have to spend the money, and we're trying to show them that there are things you can and should do as this locus parentis to be responsible for these young people.
Given that you did see those results where they, had reduced levels of thinking about committing suicide 12 months later, with that, Dr. Amsel, I'm not sure if you focused on the behavioral kind of economics piece of this, but do you expect to see students making those kind of decisions 12 months from now, 2 years from now, because of the pandemic? Is it going to carry that far forward? Could we have positive behaviors instilled instead?
Well, they definitely will. We hope that our work will lead to changes so that your last part it comes out true. They will have more positive things. That's what we hope will be the outcome. But we know from our other studies, Dr. Hoven has a study of looking at kids who were exposed to 9/11. So between ages of 0 and 18, they're exposed to 9/11. And when you look at them 14 years later, the kids who were exposed have twice as much mental health and 4 times as much mental health and physical health combined than the kids who aren't. And everyone told Dr. Hoven, don't go out and do this study 14 years later. Now, these kids aren't going to have a problem 14 years later. Those kids are not going to have a problem. But Dr. Hoven knew that she's into the longitudinal. That's why she starts her slide with longitudinal, that they're going to have it. So one of our goals is to communicate to the policymakers and to the health field that when COVID ends, people will continue to carry these scars, the emotional scars, they will continue to carry them. And that we don't want bad outcomes, and people need to know that, and we're going to need to create programs like the ones Dr. Hoven mentioned. They don't necessarily have to be those big and expensive, but we have to create programs to anticipate the fact that people are carrying these scars, normalize the fact that they're carrying scars, make it okay for them to talk about it, and then get people help. And again, the help doesn't have to be necessarily in the traditional ways of going to see a therapist. These days we could use phone apps. There's a lot of different things we could do to help people not carry those scars forward. But if we do nothing, they will.
Yeah, I think just to second what Larry was saying, that there's also not only going to be psychological carrying over of exposure to this disaster of a pandemic, but it'll have also, physical health consequences down the road as well.
Yeah, I think the bottom line for all of this is knowledge. Knowledge changes everything. So whether it's the kids in Guyana who are killing themselves for whatever reason, or it's people on the campus jumping off the roofs. Knowledge is very powerful, And we just ignore it. We just ignore it. Those of us who know it think, well, of course, everybody knows. They don't know. And institutions don't want to spend the money to make it known. And that's what we have to try to reverse. You know, what is it that what are the responsibilities that we have as a society to the next generation, to the current generation, to whom? We have tools, we need to use them. And they're not necessarily expensive. And as Larry said, you know, it's not necessarily going to a therapist, but we can do a lot better than we do. And knowledge is the fundamental key to that. So what can we teach the universities so they can behave better? Yeah, big job.
In the last couple of minutes, we have a lot of questions about once you get your results, do you make recommendations to the schools? Do you, go and try and get policies changed? What do you do with the results once you get them?
Well, this is very key also to who we have really from the onset been partnering with. You'll see we have representatives from National Education Association, the AAC&U, NCAA, we're partnering with people who are the policy makers and advocates for this group of our society. So we consider and we take those partnerships very, very strongly, that we're not there to just inform them as science, but we're to inform each other and to see how the findings are applicable, because there are going to be ways that we didn't see of the implications of our findings that someone who's a national academic educational advocate will see quite readily. So yes, we'll very much impose partnerships work to understand and disseminate the findings.
Maybe any closing thoughts from the three of you?
Well, I just wanted to thank the participants for coming and showing interest and asking these wonderful questions and showing their involvement and their interest. And I really appreciate them. And I think it speaks to their interest they got a wonderful education, and it speaks to their interest in continuing as we have, continuing so that the next generation can also have a wonderful education despite COVID. So everybody have a good night.
My final thought would be there's still time for other groups, schools and students to participate. So look forward to that.
Stop recruiting.
And my final thought is that we're all in this together. There's so much work to do, and it's wonderful to have the Columbia alumni wanting to know more about this kind of work. And we would welcome any input, any partnership. We have a 75-year plan. We got to change the world in 75 years, and we're already well into the 75 years. So we need all of you to help. So contact us. We're ready. We have a big job to do.
Great. I have a couple questions. One, we are recording, so we'll have this posted on the YouTube channel tomorrow, the day after, just depends on the rendering time. We also wanted to ask if we could use your PowerPoint deck and share with the attendees.
Sure.
Okay. And then we did have questions on, since you are still having new responses for your survey, can we share it with people? Are there groups we should not? I mean, I know you said you weren't trying to do athletics or certain groups, but if there are people we know, should we share the survey openly to college students?
I will definitely provide you with, when I send you the slide deck, I'll provide you with the information. I think we did it in the announcement for this presentation of how people can go to our website, college COVID-19 impact study.com to learn more and get in touch with us. But I'll give you that information as well.
Perfect. All right. Thank you all so much and have a great night.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.